Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison. I'm director of the Mandel Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. Today's session and our other events help us to serve the mission of the Mandel Center by supporting scholarship and getting important ideas out into the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to see the rest of our upcoming events. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us live. We do hope to be able to take some of your questions as we go. So feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we're also recording today's session, and we'll make the recording available afterwards on our website and via our podcast, as well as on YouTube. I also want to say that we are meeting today as the war is still going on in Gaza, with thousands upon thousands of casualties, with hundreds of people still being held hostage, with hundreds of thousands of people in harm's way. For me, and I'm sure for many of us, it's impossible not to think about the war and those who are suffering, and to wonder whether we are doing the things we should be doing. I don't have a good answer to that question, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about it a little bit as part of this conversation. My guest today is my friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Judd Levingston. Judd serves as the Director of Jewish Studies at the Jack Barrack Hebrew Academy in Philadelphia. He holds both rabbinic ordination and a doctorate from JTS. He was a Wexner Graduate Fellow, and he's been an educator and an educational leader in K-12 schools for over 2 decades. And most importantly, for our purposes today, Judd, while being an educator and educational leader, has also found a way to produce important scholarship at the same time. He's the author of Sowing the Seeds of Character, and he has just published a new book, A Moral Case for Play in K-12 Schools. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. Judd, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, John. And nice to be able to talk about my book. And also, these are difficult times. A lot of us were in Washington yesterday, and there's a lot on our minds. And play might seem frivolous, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but I think it's also really essential, even at times such as this.
Yeah. Okay. So we are going to circle back to that, but I want to start with a little bit of the backstory for this project. One of the things I always like to ask my guests on our Learning About Learning series is, tell us a little bit about how you decided that you wanted to study this subject, the subject of play, and then also tell us about your methodology, because there was a lot of serious work that went into this project, and we want to understand how that came about.
Thanks. Yeah, I could see both kind of outside of my world ways in which play somehow brought people together who are in the midst of moral conflicts, working out differences, whether it's black and white teams playing each other in rugby in South Africa, or debaters, or ping pong diplomacy in China. Somehow play enables people to break down barriers that normally divide them, and help people to grow and develop friendships, even the desegregation of Major League Baseball in 1947. And then on a personal note, right around the time I was finishing up my first book on moral education and character, I was noticing my son, then in the 7th or 8th grade, I noticed a big difference between how he would play the flute and how he would play Guitar Hero, the video game. And the feedback mechanisms were so different. And sometimes he would be really upset when he made a mistake in the flute, but he would laugh when he made a mistake in Guitar Hero. And I wondered what that was all about. And so it had something to do with learning curves and feedback and sociability. So those things intrigued me.
Yeah, well, those are interesting examples. And one of the things you talk about quite a bit in the book is the sometimes tension between play and seriousness, between play and effort, right? Sometimes some of the kids you talk with suggest that play is synonymous with fun, and then you say, well, it's a little bit more complicated, than that. But tell us a little bit about the research process. What do you
Sure.
actually do?
Sure. And I was really grateful, just a shout out to the Network for Research in Jewish Education that gave me a grant for the research. So I was able to take the fall of 2019 off, fortunately for me, right before the pandemic. In the spring before that, I did a pilot study at some Philadelphia area independent schools, single gender boys and girls schools, a progressive K-8 school on a creek. So I call it in the book, the Creek School, a Roman Catholic non-diocesan school, and then the Gladstone, I call it Friends Lower School, affiliated with Quakerism and our Quaker Network, and then the Jerusalem School, a Jewish K-5 school. So I did a pilot study speaking with administrators and speaking with a few students, and then came in the fall of 19, the big study in which I spent several days at 3 different schools doing field work, playing anthropologist, but really it's really field-based research and time-honored format for qualitative research in education. So I call one school the Aronson School in the Midwest. It's an Orthodox Jewish school, pre-K to 12. What I call Bernstein School, a Reformed Jewish day school in the Southeast. And then what I call the Carmiel School, a progressive, unaffiliated New England lower and middle school. So I spent several days doing field-based research. And then I did a lit review. It wasn't my doctoral dissertation, but it's important to know, what are people writing about play? They love to say how difficult it is to define it. So I decided I needed to try to come up with my own definition that would work for me. And then I did member checks with some of the people who were interviewed to make sure that what I wrote about was accurate. And as I shared with John, all the photographs in the book are my own, except for one of them on the cover. So I was kind of pleased to be a photographer, but also that gave me an in to talking to students, because I would photograph them. They wanted to do mugshots, but then they wanted to talk about what they were doing and what motivates them to play.
Yeah. One of the things that I really love about the book is the kind of anthropological mode. You're very expansive. You give yourself time, and therefore give your reader time to really see a lot of aspects of these schools and see them play out. And you describe that in great detail, and that's really wonderful. You really bring us inside of the schools. So at this point, I usually like to ask my guests to give us an overview of the argument of the work that we're discussing, and I do want you to do that. But as we've already talked about, we're talking together at a time when there's a war raging in Gaza, and many of us, probably everyone who's listening, it's hard to think about something that seems to be of secondary importance. So and I know, as you've already said, this is something you've been thinking about as well. So I want to put this out there as kind of a 2-part question. The first part of the question is, what's the argument for play? And the second part of the question is, what's the argument for play now?
Sure. And it's hard not to think about that. And so, so I'm happy to address both. In some ways, you could go to, who was it who said that the Napoleonic Wars were won on the fields of Eton, or Napoleon was defeated on the fields of Eton. There are so many ways in which schools prepare people for the moral dilemmas and for what might happen in wartime. And play in many ways is a rehearsal, but for what could come later, where skills are developed, you kind of learn some moves, you might exaggerate a little, you engage in rough and tumble play because you learn how your body moves in space. You do math problems and have a lot of fun with that, and then you're able to figure out codes when it really counts. So there are ways in which play can certainly prepare one for war. Not that we want to, but it helps us to figure out what our limits are. In the book, I try to advance the case. I call it a moral case for play, because I believe that play is really essential in moral development and in character development. There are 24 character strengths identified by the psychologists Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson in their book on character strengths. And there's so many ways in which moral character and moral growth can occur through different means that can take place in schools, in the context of schools. If young people develop an appreciation for the aesthetic, that can lead to an appreciation for peace. They develop teamwork through play. Certainly that can play out in life. Loyalty, self-control, curiosity, leadership, perseverance, moral courage, gratitude, humor. All these character strengths really play out both in peacetime and in wartime in so many important ways. So in many ways, I don't think play is frivolous at all. I think it's really essential. And sadly, in our time, pressures from high stakes testing means that teachers will take away recess or play time in order to advance what they think is the vital academic learning, even though so many of us know that going out on recess frees up the mind a little bit so that the students can focus on the academic tasks at hand. And similarly, I am in touch with our shaliach, our Israeli emissary, who is called back to serve on reserve duty. And he shared with me that sometimes he's on duty. He's serving on the border in the north, near the Lebanon border. And he told me sometimes his unit goes out and picks vegetables to help out the farmers. And that's kind of a brain break for him. It's playful. They're laughing. They're imagining what would they cook with these vegetables. That's just one relatively low-level form of play. Mm-hmm. And so we also know that sometimes recess is taken away from the students who need it most, the kids who can't sit still, who need to move around before they can go through the more traditional quizzes. And similarly, one of the things I advance also is that we can give quizzes and tests on content knowledge, but what happens when we take a more playful approach to learning that taps into the students' curiosity or their capacity to persevere and really work through a problem and show their work? Then they're really developing skills that can serve them in so many different ways that come up in life. It might seem frivolous or disrespectful to talk about play when there's so much turbulence, but also we might think about our history. Some scholars have documented games played by children in the Warsaw Ghetto or in the concentration camps when they had just enough energy to play. And you can probably imagine children, once you give them a ball, or they find abandoned clothes to dress up in, they find places to hide, they play hide and seek. Maybe they do role playing, they pretend to be someone else or someplace else. Play can cultivate intuition and social intelligence, and it can also bring about kindness and sharing. Healthy competition brings about physical strength and stamina. There are many ways in which play can be really important at any time.
Thank you. I appreciate the expansiveness of your answer, including, particularly struck by the idea of play persisting even under really difficult circumstances, when we might imagine that we sort of pare everything back, but in fact there's some evidence that play persists, and that suggests that it has a kind of necessary function within our social lives, within our communities, or perhaps within our psyches. I want to turn to a question about play in school and play out of school. So a lot of us have nostalgia. I'll speak for myself. I have some nostalgia about the way that, when I was young, when I was a kid, my life was much less structured than the way a lot of kids' lives are now. And it does feel like we've lost something important. Sometimes people say things like, kids don't know how to be alone, particularly with technology and social media. They don't know how to create their own opportunities. And you talk about that, and that's part of the book. But the book is about a moral case for play in schools, in K-12 schools. So tell us why play is important for schooling in particular.
Sure. Yeah, that's something that I was especially interested to research. So again, I was really grateful for the Edinburgh grant that enabled me to visit schools and really spend time and see what goes on in the academic classes. There's a beautiful quotation or a beautiful passage from a book by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, who wrote a study of play in 1951 entitled Homo Ludens, Playful Humanity. And he wrote towards the beginning of the book, play is a thing on its own, even if one's language possesses no general concept to express it. Play cannot be denied. You can deny, if you like, nearly all abstractions, justice, beauty, truth, goodness, mind, God. You can deny seriousness, but not play. And I've often thought about play in schools. There's so many times when kids have to demonstrate interest and they're being asked to show their motivation. And you really see them play with abandon when they enter what the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi describes as a flow experience. Hungarian name, complicated for gringos to say, but he writes about flow experiences. And I was able to see flow experiences in different ways in schools when kids get immersed in a project and when they're immersed in a group work. There are many ways in which it can unfold. So I developed in the book a taxonomy to describe 3 different kinds of play in schools. The first, and I like alliteration, so I called the first, they all begin with C, conceding, cautious, and complementary, in which play is brought forward because it makes learning a little more fun, but it's also a concession from the teacher. Like if we play a game out of it, it'll be a little more fun. So we do a Quizlet, or we do a fun kind of quiz online, a Kahoot, as there are different programs out there, or Blooket. So it's a little bit more fun. And that's one way in which certainly in an academic class, you can set up competition, all kinds of fun things, but that doesn't necessarily promote moral growth. Committed and curricular is the second level, continuing with the alliteration with C. Play is a vehicle for learning. The teacher thinks carefully about how play can really advance the learning, and they build in playful assignments. It might be group work in which I saw one class in which they were tracing Betsy Ross's sewing of the American flag using cereal box designs, and that was very playful, a lot of fun. But also there was an element of group work that was really important to the project, or a different project among some 4th graders or 3rd graders when they were doing sentence completions and playing with language and seeing how imaginative they could get. And they had a lot of fun really bringing the imagination forward using colorful language. So there's appreciation for the aesthetic and wordplay. And then the 3rd level is what I call character building, in which play is leveraged to support moral growth and character development in the context of the class or academic program. So role playing, in which they have to demonstrate empathy, or exercises around moral dilemmas and case studies. Artwork that gives kids an opportunity to ask existential questions, such as a Tanakh, a Bible class that I saw at what I called the Carmiel School, the community school, where they were using torn paper midrash to express the family dilemma, the violence of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. So many ways in which play and playful activities can really build character and empathy. I'd like to backtrack for a moment and try to explain, what do we mean by play? Scholars of play have identified many different kinds of play. So there's what we most often think about, physical or kinesthetic play. Go out on the playground and move your body, dance, or move around the classroom and interact in different ways. Rough and tumble play means that the kids are giving permission. You can tell it's rough and tumble play because they're smiling, they're laughing, they want to do more, roly-poly. But when you see a grimace, then you know it's no longer play. And then that's when the teacher needs to put a stop to it, or if they're rolling around and someone's about to get hurt. There's language play that promotes combinations of ideas in new ways. There's playing with numbers and spatial relations and sets, but that can lead to who's in and who's out, who's in this set, who's not in this set. Questions of inclusion can emerge, not just is 1, 2, 3 in the set, but not 11, 12, 13. There's exploratory play that comes out of curiosity. There's constructive play that might involve building, whether with sand or blocks or technology or moving water around. Sorry, there's an announcement.
That's just to make it clear that we are in an authentic setting. You are speaking to us from an actual school with actual announcements for actual students in the classrooms.
And now we know where the 6th graders and 11th graders are supposed to be next period.
Yeah.
And then there's fantasy play that encourages time travel into the past, present, and future. And there was a wonderful moment in a Civil War history unit of they were 7th or 8th graders, 7th graders at the Bernstein School, the Reformed Jewish Day School in the Southeast, where the teacher put on a top hat and asked the students to travel back in time. And then the next period, he was talking with the 8th graders about their upcoming trip to Washington, when they would be going back into time to the 60s and the civil rights era. And then, of course, social play that requires cooperation, negotiation, and role playing. So many ways in which play can unfold in schools. I just learned that the classroom that I'm in is about to be used by a class, it appears. I thought that it was, this is a real school. What I'm going to do is try to move, if there's a way to put this on pause for a moment, or John, if you can fill up some space for a moment, I'm going to at least mute myself while you see me walk through the halls.
Okay, well, I'm gonna tee up two questions that I'm gonna ask you to follow up with, Judd, as soon as you get the chance. One has to do with class, because it actually was one of the topics. There are many things I could ask you about from the book, but one of the topics that you considered is the role of class in play, and by class I mean socioeconomic class. So the field work for the project took place in independent or parochial schools. You already mentioned the initial work was in a variety of different schools, and then the more extensive field work was in 3 different Jewish day schools. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the intersection of play and social class. And the second question has to do more specifically with Jewish education. So you know, as I said in the introduction, you are an educator and educational leader with decades of experience. And of course, the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education, we are thinking particularly about questions in Jewish education. So the arguments in the book are relevant for lots of people in lots of different places. But I'm particularly interested to hear why a Jewish educator is interested in doing this work, and you know, what you found specifically in Jewish settings. So the 2 questions were, one about social class, socioeconomic class, and the second about Jewish education in particular.
Thank you. And now I'm in our upper school director's office with some school swag, and this is what I'm happy to answer those questions. Really interesting questions, because I think play does look different in different social class groups. There's the economics of what kinds of resources do you have. There are issues of safety and opportunities to play. If you have to work after school, then it means you're not doing after school sports. You need to have clean recess space. And is the space creative, or is it just rote? There's a whole movement for playground architecture, and we had a guest speaker at our school a couple of years ago who spoke about providing open space and also loose parts for kids to play with. Is there a jungle gym and a slide, or are there tires and you know, well sanded wooden pieces, pails and shovels, even sleds, all kinds of things, even whether or not there's snow? Are there things for kids to use their imagination and play and interact with one another, or are things fixed? So that's a really important dimension to play. I've got a neighbor and friend, Anna Barrison, who's written several books about play in schools, including one about play in the pandemic, which also is so recent. By the way, there were some wonderful examples of play in the midst of the pandemic, while our focus is now on the war. I saw, in many respects, more imaginative teaching among the teachers, my colleagues with whom I work during the pandemic. And I was kind of sad to see the pandemic, and only for that reason. I'm glad people are more healthy now, and thank goodness for the vaccinations, but people were having creative assessments, because you don't want to have kids take the same test online where they might cheat. So instead, there's much more original work when someone's producing artwork or writing a skit, or engaging in their own interpretations, or extending the storyline beyond what the author wrote. And Anna Barrison, in her work, she found that sometimes people in lower economic class schools that serve kids from a lower economic class, that they may cut recess short, or there's more of a suspicion of violence. But what she found in her observations were that the fighting that occurred at the end of recess was actually at the end of recess, not because the kids weren't getting along, but they were mad. They were angry because recess was over.
Mm-hmm.
And so they brought that agitation to the lines when they were told suddenly, put down your balls and line up. You have to get back to class.
Mm.
And lunch is over and recess is over. So that kind of jarring, abrupt end to recess, that's what changes.
So I'm keeping an eye on the clock and noticing that we're, as always, the time has flown by.
Right.
Adjust the
yeah, I
question.
do. Thank you. I do want to get to Jewish education because that was really fun for me to see at the Bernstein School. It was right at before Pesach, before Passover. So they were actually in the spring of 2019. And there's so many ways in which our tradition engages and encourages play. Think about Purim, Hanukkah, Pesach. We love to play and sing. And here we are making fun of the 10 plagues. Could you imagine living through 10 plagues? But instead we throw ping pong balls to symbolize hail, and we throw frogs for the frogs, and and maybe we dye our water red for the blood and think it's a riot. And so there's a way in which our tradition does encourage play, and or even in a more extended way. There was a Hollywood-inspired Seder that I observed with an MC, and instead of the traditional 4 children who are wise and rebellious, simple, and unsure about a question, they were curious or musical or helpful. So there are many ways in which play can be a part of Jewish education and really extend Jewish education and strengthen it. When kids in a 12th grade class observed film and they were asked to critique it from a Jewish perspective, that was really meaningful for them. Or when students in my own 8th grade class will, in a couple months, don't tell them, they're going to put one of the rabbis on trial for either going against God. Some of them go against God, or were they right or were they wrong? So putting them on trial. The rabbis disagree about the Garden of Eden story. So there are many ways in which we can use play to extend Jewish education in very creative ways. The moral education piece is so vitally important. In these remaining minutes, I just want to make sure I address in my school. One of the things I've tried to lead us through is the establishment of 4 values that can guide us, our Derech Eretz values of honor and moral courage, kindness, and community. And we try to play with those values by thinking about how can we interact with one another in playful ways, while extending those values, and show kindness. Even if it feels funny to hold the door, you make fun of it a little bit, but you're still holding the door open for someone. And so in those ways, you can really use play. My favorite example is some kids got me to start an ultimate Frisbee team, and we found that it was ultimately Jewish, as I wrote in an article for Prisma's magazine, Hayedion. We don't have professional referees. We referee our own games, and we rely on integrity. Good playing means good teamwork. We try to win, but we cheer on the other team. And in that way, just like the rabbis in the Talmud, we preserve the other team's opinion and their views.
That's a beautiful.
So there's
many beautiful connection.
So many ways in which play can be ultimately Jewish.
Sure. I'm looking at the clock, and as I said, always the time flies by. It flies by. I'm going to just name a couple of questions that we won't have time to address, but I think it's worth surfacing just as part of the conversation. So there's a really good question that one of our audience members has posed about the assessment of play. And we don't really have time to talk about it, but it's such a good question because we know how assessment drives so much of our planning. The things that we end up getting assessing are the things that sort of crowd out time for other things. And even as a thought experiment, what would it mean to assess play is a really, really good question. And then there's another really helpful question that I want to surface about communicating the value of play to to communities, to families, to parents, when it seems to be kind of countercultural. I mean, one way we can communicate is just tell them to buy the book and, and read the book. That would be a good thing. But I'm sure there's lots more to say about like, what would it mean to actually have a discourse around play that feels different, that feels that honors play in a different kind of way. But given that our time is up, Judd, I want to give you the last word. Tell us why this research matters, especially for Jewish educators and Jewish leaders.
And I think that's the answer to, my answer will be the same to what you also posed about how to convince people or how to encourage people. What I learned is that play and education are so integral to one another. What we do in Jewish education is we create character, and play creates character. And play is not just fun, it's helping people to choose and helping people to really extend themselves and project themselves forward. So play could not be more vital in Jewish education and in education in general. With regards to assessing, there's a wonderful creativity rubric that I put in the chat, published by ascd.org. You just put that in. And there are ways to assess it by seeing how much do people extend themselves or how much do they just produce something that's derivative. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, it's creative and it's not rote, and it creates the kind of 21st century individuals we really want to see leading our Jewish community in the future, showing creativity, responding to the challenges of the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you.
It's been an honor for me to speak with you, John, and speak with our audience. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Judd. It's great to talk with you about your work. And one of the things that I was thinking about in reading the book and still thinking about is, the emphasis on character is so well placed and so important. And one of the aspects of character that I'm now thinking about is actually the quality of playfulness, and what does it actually mean to cultivate playfulness in all kinds of good ways. And is that something that we would want our institutions to cultivate and to be alert to promoting and preserving? Thank you all for joining us. I encourage you to check out the Mandel Center events page to learn about other upcoming events. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube page, our podcast. Our next event I want to mention will be a spotlight session on November 30th. I will be speaking with several of my colleagues here at Brandeis. It's a special event to mark the 75th anniversary of the university. Judd, thank you again for being with me at this Learning About Learning session. Thank you all for joining us. Be well.